We know it hasn't happened for 150 years, and it may never happen again.
When I heard about this regatta, I signed up instantly.
I look at some of these boats, and they're boats that I used to read about when I was a kid.
The America's Cup lies at the summit of a competitive sailor's aspirations. For owners who build boats, sailors who toil tirelessly, and all those involved in the Cup, it's worth money, blood, sweat, and tears. By the summer of 2001, the America's Cup had been a sailing holy grail for 150 years. The America's Cup left England in the summer of 1851, and at daybreak on August the 18th, 2001, it came back. In a traditional Maori ceremony, New Zealand, current holders of the Cup, brought the trophy back to where it all began. For 150 years, countries have raced for this symbol of ocean and technological supremacy. Thousands lined the docks and the waterfront for an early morning ceremony that was heavy with tradition. It heralded the beginning of a remarkable week, and for the world of sailing, it was an historical moment.
I think it was 7 years ago, in fact, that Keith Beacom, the famous photographer, said, has the squadron realised that in 2001, which is only 7 years away, it will be the 150th anniversary of the America's Cup. Don't you think we ought to lay on some sort of a special regatta to mark the occasion?
So I said, well, we're certainly going to do something at the Royal Yacht Squadron and the New York Yacht Club, because I realised, of course, that being the historian of the Royal Yacht Squadron, that we had both together organised this race. They challenged us, and we had responded.
I never thought that this thing would come together. There was no examples to follow here. This is a total custom. It's a one-off. This has gone way beyond it, and I'm not just being polite. It really has. It's in a class by itself.
It was all in celebration of this boat. Anchored off the Royal Yacht Squadron was America. The low black schooner with the distinctive twin-raked masts sailed to Cowes in 1851, challenged 14 other British boats, and won. The win by the Americans was unexpected and started a rivalry of nations.
If you ask why, I think it is because that she was just so radically different in her design. Was it the Earl of Anglesey, I believe, who said, if she's right, we've all been pointing our boats in the wrong direction for years, because she was fine in the bow and broader at the stern, while the English boats were all sort of cod's head and mackerel-tailed.
America won the Cup, which then took her name and became known as the America's Cup. Over the years, there have been 4 generations of America's Cup boats. America herself was one of the big boats, measuring 102 feet overall. On that fateful day, she was raced by 13 crew. 1 English pilot, a Royal Yacht Squadron representative, and 6 guests. The Royal Yacht Squadron hosted that first ever Cup race, so it's fitting that the Yacht Club in Cowes should host the Jubilee. 208 boats came for a festival of sailing, with boats from all 4 generations of the Cup's history. From the replica of America to the magnificence of the J-boats, the class which fought for the Cup in the 1930s. And including Endeavour, the 1934 Challenger from Britain. The 12 metres, the powerful and highly technical designs that raced for the Cup from 1958 to 1987, included Intrepid, the 1967 and 1970 winner from the USA. And Australia too, the winged keel wonder that won in 1983. The IACC, the modern thoroughbred races of the America's Cup, were well represented. From Team New Zealand's Black Magic, the 1995 Cup winner, to Prada's Luna Rossa, the 2000 challenger, and the GBR Challenge, Britain's first entry into Cup circles in 14 years. This invitation-only Jubilee regatta was for boats that had either competed for the America's Cup or were from a club that had mounted a challenge. Alongside boats with their own America's Cup history were boats like Bear of Britain, and respected and revered classics like Twiga, built in 1909 and representing the Yacht Club de Monaco. For 1 week in August, the streets and waters of Cowes were a who's who of sailing. From Russell Coutts and Dean Barker, who successfully defended the Cup in 2000 for New Zealand, to Bill Koch and Buddy Melges, winners for the USA in 1992. Dennis Conner, who many call Mr. America's Cup. The men behind Australia too, Alan Bond and John Bertrand. Sir Peter Blake, who led New Zealand's first win in 1995. Ernesto Bertarelli, who leads the new Swiss Alinghi team. And Peter Harrison, the man behind the new British Challenge. They were all here, America's Cup personalities from the last 54 years. And watching over all of them, Olin Stevens, a legend in America's Cup history, having designed and built more America's Cup winners than any other man. The America's Cup stars were in good company. King Juan Carlos of Spain sailed his boat Bribon, and from a Spanish king to an English prince, Prince Philip, Admiral of the Royal Yacht Squadron, who, with a little help from the Red Arrow's aerial display, opened the event and turned a dream into a reality.
Some people, I think, must find it rather ironic that actually here we are organising a celebration of 150 years of abject failure by British yachts and yachtsmen, many of them our own members. Let's face it, we lost it in 1851 and we haven't yet got it back.
Not for lack of trying. Britain challenged repeatedly through the late 1800s and into the 1900s when the J-class was introduced. This was the first time a proper class was created for America's Cup racing. But the J-class spanned only from 1930 to 1937, and only a handful were ever built. They are the Leviathans of the sea. On the first day of racing, the J-boats stole the day. These majestic boats are the oldest surviving challengers for the America's Cup, racing in the 1930s, but never yielding a British winner. On that first day, the Solent was boiling, but the Jays handled it with a grace and elegance that speaks of a different era of racing. In the early days, the challengers sailed across the Atlantic just to get to the start line.
These were boats which were certainly capable of crossing it. So were the defenders, largely. Boats which had accommodation. In fact, one of them had a menagerie on board almost. Certainly a monkey that ran loose around it. And that was a challenger for the America's Cup. We look at it strangely now, but it wasn't strange to them. I did actually get to interview a man who'd been a deckhand on Shamrock 3 when she raced against Reliance in 1903. It was a wonderful occasion to find out how those guys did it in those boats. They were really men working machines, and not the machines working the men this time. It was really hard.
The Jubilee was the Jays' first competitive appearance together in UK waters for 64 years. Shamrock 5, built in 1930, was the oldest of the three. The tea baron, Sir Thomas Lipton, challenged the US for the Cup 5 times, but was never successful. He became known affectionately as the world's best loser. Shamrock 5 was his 5th and final challenge for the America's Cup in 1930. Racing against Shamrock were the lovely lines of Velshida. Built in 1933, she was famously named after her owner's 3 daughters, Velma, Sheila and Daphne. She raced with the Jays, but never for the Cup. and Sir T.O.M. Sopwith's 1934 Challenger, Endeavour. Now in American hands, her owner, Dennis Kozlowski, filled this J with his Volvo Ocean racing team, Tyco.
It's the most magnificent boat you'll ever sail on. It's a piece of furniture, and it's a real machine. You go upwind in that in 30 knots of breeze, and you can really feel the boat. It's just 170 tons of power. And you think back on how they sailed those boats, but you have the utmost respect on how those guys sailed them without the equipment that we've got now.
The 37 crew on board, instead of the 30 or so that would have raced her in the Cup years, still had to work hard to sail her effectively.
It takes us about 5 minutes to drop the spinnaker. So you've got to really time things out, and it takes a minute to tack the boat, so you can't just decide to tack or to jibe.
Joining the Jays to race for the Hennessy Trophy was Cambria. She's a 23-metre boat built in 1928 for Sir William Berry, later Lord Camrose, proprietor of the Daily Telegraph and of Yachting World magazine. Cambria raced with the J boats in the 1930s, but never for the Cup.
Day 1, Phillips Day. In the western Solent, the enormous rigs of the J-class yachts towered up towards the murky grey cloud base. The Jays raced up to the Needles at the western tip of the Isle of Wight before turning for an adventurous downwind sleigh ride. Someone had pressed pause on Summer as the wind increased to over 30 knots. On Shamrock, there was a little hesitation before they flew the enormous spinnaker. They'd seen what had happened on Valshida, 16 crew on the bow working for a solution. But muscle and manpower could not solve Shamrock's spinnaker situation. The sail exploded. Endeavour charged down the Solent, leading the Jays. Last of the Jays to increase the horsepower and throw a cloud of white and blue against the dull grey skyline. As she stormed down a foaming Solent, she delivered an amazing sight and a Day 1 race win. Same day, but a little further east, not as rough, but still plenty of wind. A little too much for the 12 metres. They did have a chance for a warm-up and completed a practice race before calling it a day. But as they headed back to turn an empty marina into a sailing treasure chest, there was still plenty to watch on a lumpy Solent. The Spirit of Tradition class, including the 76-foot W class. 2 have been built, and they were both racing here. Savannah, built in 1997, a labour of love for American Randolph Watkins. Truly classic, built in 1995. One of the legends out on the water was Ticonderoga. Built in Boston in 1936, she set more race records than any other boat built. But it was the modern class that showed 150 years of technology makes a difference. Stealth and extra beat with Dennis Conner on board were thriving in the big weather. Some, though, were having problems. In the air and on the ground. Moments to spoil their day, but not their week.
Ellen MacArthur presented the Phillips Day Awards just one day in, and the regatta was already something special. It was a fitting end to a champagne day. At the Jubilee, the largest collection of 12-metre yachts ever assembled came to race for the Prada 12-metre World Championships. These are the yachts that were the hardware for 3 decades of America's Cup racing.
After World War II, the J boats were out. It was way too expensive. There was a lot of austerity, and well, I think the New York Yacht Club looked around and said, we need a boat that we can work with, that's big enough, but still somewhat affordable.
They came up with the 12-metre, a boat that would define the Cup racing from 1958 to 1987. 12 metres are much smaller than J boats, and it takes only 11 people to crew them. And when they raced at the Jubilee, they filled the course with the intensity that made them famous. The 35 boats spanned over half a century of design, and the most famous of all was Australia 2. In 1983, the crew of Australia 2 wrested the Cup away from America for the first time since 1851. the New York Yacht Club had held it for 132 years. Alan Bond, on his fourth challenge, had commissioned a design that gave Australia the ultimate edge.
Yacht Club or Dennis or the English or whatever it was always, we were playing chess with them. Check, 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 and today we went, mate.
I had kind of a magic moment. I had tears in my eyes the other day. Here it is, we're in this basin. There are 35 12 meters of all ages, you know, the wing keel boats, the split rudder boats, these old classics, and it's about time for the boats to get underway and get out. My first thought is, how are these boats going to get out of this harbor? And then, out of the blue, the tender for KA6 starts playing the theme, The Men from Down Under, just like they did in 1983, and suddenly this whole aura of 12 meters went through my body, and I got tears in my eyes thinking back to that magic time when they took the America's Cup away from the New York Yacht Club, and it told me that racing 12 meters was magic.
It was magic to see Australia 2 back on the water after spending 15 years in the Western Australia Maritime Museum. Australia 2, the boat known for her revolutionary winged keel design that took the sailing world by storm.
And it was a huge step at the time we took that. There was no technology in that direction whatsoever. And I think the next person that wins the America's Cup will have to find some technological edge or some superhuman effort if everything else is equal, because you have to be better than the people that hold it to win it.
And her original 1983 crew, Bar 2, came to sail her.
We're here really to celebrate our 1983 victory. We never thought we would get together again, and then this opportunity emerged, and we've immersed ourselves in the 150th year celebrations, and we were able to get the yacht out of the museum. It's been in the National Maritime Museum since 1988, and this is the first time it's campaigned again since then. Some of our crew haven't sailed since '83. They actually retired and went off to enjoy life. But we'll be competitive.
Today is sort of possibly the last show I'll have with the America's Cup. I'm lucky to have got so far. I'm 90 now. I started off, I was quite a boy.
Australia 2 raced in the Grand Prix class, competing on equal terms with boats of much newer designs. She raced against boats like Hisar, with Gary Jobson, a Cup winner in 1977, calling the shots. She was also up against the plastic fantastic, Kiwi Magic. And Russell Coutts and Company aboard South Australia. There were 3 classes of 12s at the Jubilee, Classic, Modern and Grand Prix, and so many were here because of a special freighter, a major logistical feat for the organisers that shipped them, fully rigged, across the Atlantic.
We felt it was important to bring boats that would represent yachting over the period, boats that were on the scene. We're sitting on one right now, Black Knight, that was the long-term committee boat for the America's Cup, mostly in the 12-meter era. In the late 60s and 70s, this boat was like the mothership for the America's Cup.
Black Knight was the committee boat when Australia 2 finally took the Cup away from the States in 1983. At the Jubilee, she watched over 12 metres of all ages, from Ern's Scene of 1912, the oldest 12-metre in Cowes, 1933's Flicker 2, a British boat but with a strong German crew, to Sovereign, the 1964 British Challenger, now being sailed by a French team. Columbia was America's 1958 Defender, racing against Scepter, the Challenger. It was the first time the 2 boats had met on the same course since that challenge. And perhaps most famous of all in America's Cup history, but little known by others, was Intrepid, the 1967 and 70 winner, a breakthrough boat designed by Olin Stevens. Intrepid's owner, Jack Curtin, had brought a team of America's Cup veterans as crew. They had planned for 4 years to race at the Jubilee and had given Intrepid a new mast, boom and sails, even adding a new deck layout with a special pit so what Curtin calls his statesman sailors could stand up while carefully trimming the sails.
And we even took into consideration the height and weight of some of the people who had to get out of the way of the boom when it was crossing, when we put the deck layout together. And it helps when you take a boat that was in serious need of repair.
Curtin bought Intrepid in 1996 when his sailing friends convinced him he should help to keep her in America and not let her be sold to a European buyer. At the Jubilee, it was tight racing and they wanted to win.
If we finish first of the week, the grinders get to shave George's head. So we got a lot of people rooting for us to win.
Primed and ready to race, Intrepid's toughest competitor would be another Olin Stevens designed boat. Freedom, the America's Cup winner in 1980, who some say is the fastest 12-metre ever built. Olin Stevens designed these two 12s and 4 other America's Cup yachts and was helmsman for Ranger's final victorious America's Cup win in 1937. For him, this week was quite an experience.
It's a tremendous education and an eye-opener to me. I never expected anything quite like this, and I couldn't have any better time.
It was the infamous big boat catamaran race in 1988 that marked the end of 12-metre racing. No restriction on size had been imposed when the 12-metre rules came in. New Zealand challenged the States with a boat that at 123 feet was the most formidable Cup challenger since the J-boats. Dennis Conner responded with a catamaran and won easily.
The great joy was that 2 most wonderful boats were built for that 1988 Cup, even if it was a dog and pony show. But the best thing that came out of it was the International America's Cup class, the boats that are used today.
A new rating class was created after 1988, the International America's Cup class. The boats would be around 75 feet in length and crewed by 16 people. The 12-metre era was over. This is a class with a reputation for big money, big stakes and big names. It's a world of strategies and tactics. When New Zealand captured the Cup in 1995 and then retained it in 2000, they proved they were able to play in a league dominated by the Americans.
It's an unfair sport. It's a winner-take-all. And that's what's wonderful about it. When you win, you take everything.
Cup isn't just about the sailing, although at the end of the day, you've got to win the yacht race. But it's a game. It's a dirty tricks game. It's a game where no holds are barred, where people will, some people will go to all lengths to try and win. And if you think you're going to enter it and it's going to be a gentleman's game and whatever, don't enter, because you're going to come away very sore with lots of knife slits in your back.
No one knows that better than Bill Koch, who brought back both his 1992 Cup winner America Cubed and her 1992 challenger for the Cup, Il Moro di Venezia 5, especially for the Jubilee. Koch refurbished them both, replacing large amounts of aluminium honeycomb deck around the winches and mast and keeping the old graffiti inside. Following the Jubilee, both boats were to be shipped back to the States and put on permanent display.
The International America's Cup class were racing for the Louis Vuitton trophy. Before these machines went into the familiarity of head-to-head confrontation, they had to earn the right to do so. So the week began with fleet racing, and it began in perfect conditions. Many of the yachts and teams competing had already been to the America's Cup. For many of the players here, their life was the America's Cup, their daily routine shaped by its demands. But the home team were new to it all. Peter Harrison's GBR Challenge was racing against old hands like Prada and Team New Zealand. The first British challenge for the America's Cup since 1987, based in Cowes with quite an operation. GBR 52 won the first fleet race.
We had a good start. It's really shifty. I think, you know, Ado made some great calls, which gave us the edge on the first beat. Everyone sailed really well, nice and safe, nice and tidy. So always good to start with a win.
So early days, but GBR Challenge had made their mark in a fleet where nothing was being given away.
To win the America's Cup, you have to do what it takes to win at all costs. And we've always wondered whether the Brits have the mental fortitude to do that. And I think they're showing that here.
But the week wasn't all about racing. It was also about tradition. At every America's Cup, the social highlight is the ball. And it was the same here. Here, Sir Richard Branson, the Aga Khan, and Dennis Conner were part of a flamboyant reminder of the sheer scale of the America's Cup.
The prize is so huge. And if you can bring this sort of event back to your country, lasting many months, many years, it's worth a lot.
There on the lawns of Osborne House, former residents of Queen Victoria, were the likes of Dean Barker and King Juan Carlos of Spain.
There's a great potential here. The squadron have got this one right when I heard about it. So I had a chat with the harbour master and I said to him, do you know what might happen? He said, we can't fit them. I said, they're coming.
Well, we're still doing okay.
The highlight was the auction for a unique collection of Hennessy cognac.
We actually do have in our stocks cognacs that are even older than the America's Cup herself, dating back to 1800. Is your name on the bottle?
Phillips auctioneers conducted the bidding of the 31 bottles, each distilled in a year of a cup challenge.
At 250, it's your last chance in the distance. Any further bids have you all done now? Are you sure? 300,000. Don't lose your bottle.
Bill Coke got what he wanted, but it cost him £310,000.
Come on up to the table here, come on.
The money will go to aid the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, while Coke says the bottles will go to his private collection and he'll probably never drink them.
You know, after spending $68 million on the America's Cup, this was rather cheap.
Over 2,000 people were at the ball, but many more lived the event. Finding a place to watch was easy. Finding a place to stay, much harder. So many people came to Cowes that accommodation spilled over onto the water. Black Watch, a 400-room cruise ship, served as a floating hotel and as a backdrop to the racing. And this week, Black Watch's guests included Sir Peter Blake and the team from the Swiss Alinghi Challenge, 10 minutes from Cowes, but in her own world. Many people came for the whole week, but for some, there was only one race, the UBS Jubilee round the island. When the day of the Jubilee dawned, it was perfect, with a light southwesterly breeze and sunshine.
The race around the island with our boat and our team against all these other incredible boats representing the history of the America's Cup will be a very, very special day, that's very clear.
Well, I've raced around the island several times before, but this will be a special event with the caliber of the competition and the magnificent boats, and it's always a challenging race around the island.
Thousands of people had made the pilgrimage to Cowes. Boats prepared for a race that could take from 5 hours to all day. There were some of the biggest names in the sport on the water, but not all of them.
I don't think I'm going to take part because I want to see it rather than be in the midst of it. And I've done enough sailing not to worry about that. So I'm going to be out here watching the start, and I'll wander around and watch the finish and just get enthusiastic about the sights. I want my kids to have a look. I want to be with them and see what goes on. So that to me is just as important as being on board.
The UBS Jubilee race around the island was exactly the same course America challenged 150 years ago. Starting from the Royal Yacht Squadron in Cowes, east around the Nab lightship, anchored in place to recreate the original fateful corner, onto the distinctive rock cliffs and the Needles, and back to the squadron.
3, 2, 1, go! 35 12 metres crossed the line together. The largest ever fleet start for the class. Ahead of them, many of the classics were already on their way. On board the 12s, it was all action. Hundreds of spectator boats were out there. In the air, an armada of helicopters to capture the action. Down below, the 12s punched their way eastwards down the Solent. US 61 Ecosse had a dream start, leading 4 boats that spanned 4 decades of America's Cup history. On Intrepid, the boat that Bill Ficker defended the Cup in 1970, John Kearton and his team were amongst the early leaders in the class. But there was lots of place changing. As the boats tacked upwind, the racetrack shrunk by the enthusiasm of the spectator fleet. But few were prepared to give away an inch. This may have been a celebration, but it was a race. Behind them, the bows of the IACC yachts crossed their start line within seconds of the gun. The intensity of their racing was attracting plenty of attention. But the showstopper was when the J-class yachts and Cambria began their historic race. And just to make the sight even more spectacular, the wind increased as the J's crossed the line. Endeavour, furthest away from the Isle of Wight shore, powered away. But there were so many spectator boats out there.
Chaos. Absolute chaos.
It was chaotic, but that added to the drama. For the men behind the wheels, though, massive responsibility as they battled to steer clear of trouble and to the front of the pack. Endeavour surprised the spectators as she roared to the edge of the racing area. Waving arms indicated that when you're that big, you're in charge. And they were making themselves understood. As they marched eastwards, even their most enthusiastic followers were backing off. The spirit of tradition classes provided an eyeful of history. The sun and the winds just completed the picture. Thalia, built in 1889. Mary Lee, the 1926 vintage racer, with former New York Yacht Club Commodore George Isdale calling tactics in the style of the 1850s, and Ted Hood at the wheel. She raced against the beautiful lines of Mariette of 1915. Elegantly restored, she was eventually awarded the Concours d'Elegance for the week. Like Twigger, the flagship of her class, she had opted to stay well clear of the main fleets, well out of trouble. But not all the classics were from another era. The modern class, Grand Prix racing machines that fight it out around the world, had come to do battle in this historic occasion. And there was plenty to play for. This was the class expected to deliver the fastest time around the island. And as Nicorette sliced just behind Morning Glory, it was clear that this race mattered. Nicorette started brilliantly, forcing the much larger Leopard to tack just after the start.
The boats raced from Cowes down the north side of the Isle of Wight to the Nab lightship.
Whilst the modern class was just starting their sprint around the island, the Jays had been munching up the miles. Their racing, though, was just as close. Upwind, these giants of the America's Cup had matched each other, tack for tack. Just a few boat lengths separated them. As they approached the cruise ship Black Watch, it was Endeavour that gave those on board the closest view. But it was Shamrock leading the trio, just a boat length ahead of Valshida. 3 of the most famous yachts in the world, not just on show, but delivering a race that will never be forgotten. For the 12 metres, racing was just as exciting. Victory and Intrepid had locked horns and were engaged in an absorbing battle. But there were plenty of head-to-heads out there. On board Kiwi, Nefertiti, around 20 years her junior, slid past her bows. Kookaburra, one of 3 almost identical boats built in Australia for their only ever defence in 1987, found clear wind away from the pack. So did the 1933 Flicker 2. In the moderns, the start line intensity continued. Morning Glory tacking to cover Leopard. But not all the boats were in the thick of it. On Nicorette, Ludde Ingvall had found clear air and was out on his own. But it was early days.
When America reached the lightship, it was history in the remaking. It was here, 150 years ago, that she made one of the key tactical moves of the race.
The English boats all believed, or many of them believed, that you should go outside the nav lights, i.e. leave it to starboard. But America, even with her British pilot, didn't observe this, and she got round St. Catherine's and was off.
Her move inside the lightship gave her the lead that she held to the finish.
A 150 years later, new technology did not need that advantage. Stealth. Gianni Agnelli's 94-foot, all-black, all-carbon Freres design flew around the outside of the lightship. She was on a charge and sliced off around the back of the Isle of Wight. The lightship was anchored specially for the day and became the centrepiece for spectator boats that had stayed clear of the start line frenzy and waited for the action to come to them. Russell Coutts, sailing for the Swiss Elingi Challenge that stole him away from New Zealand, took the corner first in the 12s. He was just ahead of local sailing talent aboard Crusader. Australia too punched up to the lightship in third. It was a long line of 12-metre history, still within seconds of each other, and including Columbia, the first wooden 12-metre to successfully defend the Cup in 1958. Classics and vintage boats mixed with the America's Cup races. Partridge, built in 1885, designed by the same man who built Challengers for the Cup in the late 1880s. Moonbeam, built for Queen Victoria's Doctor, was racing on her home turf, having raced at Cowsweek in the 1930s. They were being chased by the IACC class. GBR 52 led the pack. Behind, it was all on between Prada and Team New Zealand. As Prada tacked for the lightship, the Kiwis slipped inside.
The boats were racing down the back of the island now to St. Catherine's Point.
Out of the Solent onto open sea, and with most of the spectator fleet waiting the other side of the island, the race took on a new character. Conditions were kind enough for gentle sailing, even on 12 metres like Kiwi. On board Endeavour, time for contemplation. The team were leading their class, and Endeavour stayed well offshore. And as the winds lightened, she slipped past many newer designs. On the W-class Wild Horses, life was pretty relaxed.
The boats raced around St. Catherine's and onto a broader and broader reach towards the Needles.
With St. Catherine's Light behind them, GBR Challenge was still leading the IACC class. But both Team New Zealand and Prada were ready to pounce. In the modern class, Nicorette were inside the top 5, but a long way behind class leader Stealth. Mariette had found good breeze at last. And Endeavour was building on her lead in the Jays. But this race was still very much on. Valshida not far behind in second. As morning rolled into afternoon, the fleet approached the turning point at the western tip of the Isle of Wight, the distinctive Needles. From the air, it was a magnificent sight. But down below, it was intense. On board the boats, they were fighting for every inch. It was predicted to be a crowded turning mark, and it was. Once round, the boats jibed. The spectator fleet had come out to play, and again the Jays were the stars of the show. In the frenzy of the Needles, Valshida had gained on Endeavour.
For the final leg, from the Needles to the finish line outside the squadron, the sailors would have the wind at their backs in a last glorious run for home.
On board Endeavour, it was an amazing sight back to the Needles. But there was plenty of concentration on board. Valshida was still catching. On these boats, racing sailors who live the sport, whose CVs include podium places at the world's biggest sailing events. But a win on a J-class in this race would be an achievement that would last a lifetime. Stealth took 9 honours in 4 hours, 48 minutes and 9 seconds, less than half the time it took America in 1851. As the IACC leaders approached the finish, it was incredibly close. Team New Zealand in third, just ahead of Prada, GBR 52 still leading. The race changed in a second, as the spinnaker pole on the British boat sheared from the mast. In the dying seconds of the race, the British team fought to defend their position. Prada pushed past and crossed the line 2 seconds ahead after 5 hours and 17 minutes of racing. This story, though, was far from over. Behind, the fleets poured down the Solent against a strong tide. For the crew, there were so many individual battles still being fought. For the spectators, it was one great festival of sail. Staying out of the tide, the yachts went closer and closer to the island. On one flank, shoreside spectators, on the other, an armada of spectator boats churning up the Solent. Great Britain's second IACC entry found the gap between yachts that suddenly looked so small. Endeavour was gliding home and finishing her job. Over 5.5 minutes ahead of second place Valshida. One to remember for the Endeavour crew. There were so many sights to remember. And so many intriguing battles. Russell Coutts came out on top in the 12-metre class, first home on South Australia. But Australia too, John Bertram with Alan Bond alongside and a team of Australian heroes who crossed the world for this one, were just 2.5 minutes behind. Results settled on the water. It was very different in the IACC class.
Team GBR were waiting for the results of their protest against Prada over the incident in the final moments of the race.
We were disappointed to have let them catch up as far as we did. We were disappointed that things broke on the boat when we put such a lot of care into looking after the boats. And we were also really quite angry with Prada for pushing us inside the exclusion zone. And I've no doubt that all 3 boats will be disqualified from the race. It's just a question of whether we can get back in because we were forced there against our will.
In the end, Great Britain's protest that they'd been unfairly pushed into an exclusion zone and forced to jibe was upheld. It was some retribution in the IACC class for that race 150 years ago.
Peter Harrison and the Team GBR Challenge winners today.
And Stealth was fastest on the day. It was quite a day.
I think a lot of people who haven't even been sailing for years have come over to have a look and just spectate. A lot of people aren't even out on the water, but they just thought they better show up. Probably will never see anything like this again in our lifetime, I dare say.
With a historic race around the island, a memory to be savoured, there was still plenty more racing to come in the America's Cup Jubilee. It was back to confrontation around the cans, inside the confines of the Solent, as crews competed for the overall awards in each category. And like in the Round the Island race, a podium place at this event was quite an attraction for some of the finest names in the game.
No one could touch Endeavour in the Jays or Russell Coutts in the 12-metre Grand Prix class. But in the other 12-metre races, it was a battle. Classics like Gleam US 11 battled Ernestine of 1912. In the modern class, Intrepid, Victory and Freedom traded first and third. Meanwhile, in the IACC class, fleet racing had given way to the more traditional one-on-one match racing of the America's Cup in the battle for the Louis Vuitton trophy.
Prada had already beaten one GBR Challenge team in the other semi-final. GBR 52 needed a good start to stay in it, but they were against the holders of the America's Cup, Team New Zealand. It was tense on board the British boat as they tacked just behind the committee boat, with New Zealand in their sights. They prepared to commence combat. It was an aggressive but slick start by the America's Cup new boys, with the umpires confirming that neither boat had a penalty. As the British boat threw themselves into attack, GBR Challenge sailing manager Ian Walker was impressed.
Okay, I had the con, as they say in the movie. Makes up for yesterday.
The British team turned that start line advantage into a semi-final victory and a place in the final against Prada.
As the crews left for the final day of racing, a regatta that had started as a festival of sail had evolved into a ferocious competition. On Freedom, deliberations of what it would take to win. So much work had gone into getting here.
Do a 5 and a 1.
And we've spent a lot of hours. The team has really worked hard to remove all the engines, the toilets, the beds, the microwaves. And we went so far as to refair the hull. We got the original lines drawings from Owen Stevens and made templates up and checked the hull and used microballoon technology to get it right back to his original specs.
Freedom, the 1980 Cup winner that Dennis Conner might have raced again against Australia too, but for the regulations that stopped him. Jacquet had found her in a French shipyard, and his daughter had helped him convince the owner to sell. They'd done a lot of work, but without a lot of time. Now they were winning, but only just. And the real pressure was coming from Intrepid. Would all the work be enough?
Russell Coutts had already secured victory in the 12-metre Grand Prix class, but there were still plenty of positions to fight for on the final day. Australia 2 and Crusader right in the thick of it. But there were plenty of other boats, like Don Wood's Italia, that were looking for a final day finale. Kiwi Magic were having a good week. They had a good final day start. Australia 2 were in familiar territory, up with the leaders. But if Coots had dominated this class, Kiwi Magic was going to dominate the day. It was a good final day for Crusader, who finished third. But not everyone can be at the front. So the final bullet in the Grand Prix 12-metre class went to Kiwi Magic. Second overall for them. A final fourth and third overall for John Bertrand and Australia 2. In the classics, Flicker 2, Nyala and Sovereign were to take the podium places. The last race determined the order. The distinctive green hull of Nyala was amongst the leaders right from the start. But so was their greatest rival, Sovereign, who went on to win the race and the week. Nyala's final race second delivered them second overall, just one place ahead of Flicker. In the modern 12s, Freedom's final day was about completing a job. Their greatest rival, Intrepid, was off games following a collision. This was a day for smooth sailing. And that's exactly how they sailed. The celebrations were for far more than a week's work.
Ernest Jacquet and crew had won the modern class. Australia 2 had won the hearts of the crowds.
There was plenty of tension for the final of the Louis Vuitton Trophy. Prada v GBR Challenge. The British started with better momentum, but they had another advantage. In the pre-start, they'd forced a penalty on the Italian team. Prada had to complete a 360-degree penalty turn. As the British sliced ahead of Prada and prepared to tack back to the right-hand side of the track, everything was going according to plan for Peter Harrison's new kids on the America's Cup block. Prada rolled into a silky smooth tack as the British team headed for the favoured right-hand side of the racetrack. The British team had huge local support, and the support was getting exciting. GBR 52 had sailed a seamless first leg. Tack by tack, they'd more than matched the Italians. As they rounded the top mark and headed downwind, Prada's Luna Rossa had it all to do. At least 3 boat lengths behind, and still carrying a penalty. GBR 52 was charging downwind as Prada's crew hoisted their giant spinnaker. All the time, the wind was increasing. The Italians jibed, and the hunt was on. This was far from a one-team match. Prada was accelerating, going faster than GBR Challenge, and inch by inch eroding their lead. As the teams prepared for the upwind battle, drama. Prada's spinnaker exploded. The Luna Rossa crew had a massive job on their hands just to get the shredded sail back on board. As the British team rounded the bottom mark, they were just 2 legs away from an awesome victory. After another slick upwind leg, they rounded the top mark well ahead. Just a downwind sprint to the finish. Another smart hoist by the British team. And then the British spinnaker shattered. GBR Challenge now the target for the Italians, as Prada started the final hunt with added horsepower. The British team recovered quickly, but Prado were past. But the Italians needed more. They had to be clear enough ahead to complete the 360-degree penalty turn and still come out on top. The Italian spinnaker came down. They threw Luna Rossa into a handbrake turn, just meters from the finish. Perfect choreography would make their day. Just one mistake would open the door to GBR 52, who were heading for the finish fast. There were seconds in it as both boats headed for the line. But the cheers were coming from Luna Rossa. GBR Challenge had come so close, they'd impressed so many, but Prada had won the Louis Vuitton trophy.
It was close until the end. I think both teams put a lot of effort in. We had the penalty at the start, then we broke one spinnaker on the downwind leg, they broke a sail on the second leg, and anyway we gained enough that we could pull the penalty off at the finish. I think it was a very good race to watch for the spectators.
We've learned a hell of a lot about what you have to do to race these boats, and we've taken a lot of encouragement from being so competitive. But there's 16 very competitive people on our boat who thought they had a chance of winning, and there's 16 very disappointed people now who realise that they've just lost.
As Princess Anne arrived to preside over the closing ceremony, it was Francesco De Angelis and his team who took home the Louis Vuitton trophy. But the New York Yacht Club Cup of 1926, for making the greatest contribution to the sport of sailing through sailing in the America's Cup Jubilee, went to Australia too.
B, picked up by Russell Coots. Thank you.
And as the winners celebrated, it was local sailors aboard Bear of Britain who took home the America's Cup Jubilee Regatta overall trophy based on results during the week. The America's Cup Jubilee had brought together boats and people and an atmosphere that would never be seen again on the same waters in this lifetime. The America's Cup Jubilee was not just an unforgettable festival of sailing, but somehow much, much more.
It's going to be different because of this week. There's bonds that have been renewed, formed, and I think that this has put a lot of things in perspective. It's been a great week.
Won't make any difference. It'll be cutthroat, dirty tricks, the whole 9 yards, because the prize is so huge.
I can't imagine that 150 years ago, the 18 boats or so that went around the Isle of Wight had any idea that 150 years later, 208 boats would be celebrating their race around the Isle of Wight. And you just think to yourself, I am so happy to be alive right now to be part of this history.